For years, the Strait of Hormuz was treated like one of those places the world worried about in theory, but still assumed would keep functioning in practice. Tankers would pass, energy would flow, traders would complain about risk, and then the system would keep moving. That assumption is now breaking, not because there is a formal legal declaration that permanently closed the strait, not because every ship in the region has vanished, and not because one headline alone can explain what is happening. It is breaking because the practical reality has changed faster than the legal language. Shipping companies, insurers, crews, governments, and energy markets are all reacting to the same message at once. The waterway is becoming too dangerous to treat as normal. And that matters, because Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. It is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. A huge share of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through it, and so does a massive share of LNG linked to Gulf exporters. When traffic through a place like that slows to a trickle, the story is no longer just about regional escalation. It becomes a global price story, a supply story, and a confidence story all at the same time. Over the last several days, the picture has become much clearer. Maritime security advisories have described the threat level in and around the Strait of Hormuz as critical. Commercial vessels have been struck, fires have been reported, crews have been injured. At the same time, Iran and the IRGC have made public claims about attacks on tankers and have framed parts of the waterway as unsafe or effectively off-limits. Those claims should be treated as claims unless independently confirmed. But even when you separate verified incidents from propaganda, the practical effect is the same. Shipping behavior has changed dramatically. That is the real story here. The market does not wait for perfect clarity. Ship owners do not wait for a debate to end. Insurers do not wait for a press conference to become a legal order. When missile and drone risk moves from theoretical to active, the commercial response can happen first, and the official wording can lag behind. That is what makes moments like this so disruptive. You do not need a signed paper that says closed for a route to become unusable in practice. You just need enough danger that the people who move cargo decide the risk is no longer acceptable. And right now, that threshold appears to have been crossed for a lot of operators. That is why the phrase no-go zone is suddenly everywhere. Not because every vessel has stopped forever, and not because a court has ruled the waterway shut, but because the people who actually send ships through dangerous waters are starting to behave as if normal passage can no longer be assumed. This is where a lot of coverage gets sloppy. It is tempting to turn every update into a giant, dramatic claim. But the stronger and more accurate way to understand this is to look at the layers of evidence. First layer, confirmed maritime danger. Security advisories have documented attacks against commercial vessels in nearby waters and raised the regional maritime threat posture to the highest level. That alone is enough to force hard decisions from shipping and insurance firms. Second layer, commercial reaction. Traffic through the strait has dropped sharply, and shipping analysts have described the collapse in transits not primarily as a formal government closure, but as a market-driven retreat from intolerable risk. In simple terms, the route can remain open on paper while becoming nearly unusable in practice. Third layer, energy exposure. This is the part that makes the entire world pay attention. The Strait of Hormuz is the primary export route for key Gulf producers. Oil, oil products, and LNG all depend heavily on that corridor. Some countries have limited alternative export routes, but not enough to replace the normal volumes that move through Hormuz. And fourth layer, market psychology. The moment traders, refiners, importers, and governments begin to believe that risk in Hormuz is lasting rather than temporary, the response spreads beyond shipping. Prices move, emergency stock releases get discussed, strategic reserves come into play. Every new incident gets judged not just on physical damage, but on what it says about the reliability of future flows. That is what makes the current moment so serious. The most important point is this: you do not need every tanker to be hit for the system to seize up. You only need enough incidents, enough credible threats, and enough uncertainty that companies decide it is smarter to pause, divert, or wait. Maritime trade is built on predictability. Once predictability breaks, volume can disappear much faster than people expect. And that seems to be what we are watching now. The International Energy Agency has already described the disruption linked to the conflict as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That is an extraordinary statement, and it helps explain why even partial interruptions are having such a large effect. This is not a niche route for a handful of ships. It is one of the central arteries of the modern energy system. Think about what that means in real terms. A refinery in Asia is not just buying crude, it is buying predictability. A utility in Europe is not just buying LNG, it is buying timing, routing, and confidence that contracted supply can actually arrive. An airline does not care only about today's jet fuel price. It cares about whether fuel markets remain stable enough to plan ahead. A government watching this unfold is not simply asking whether one tanker was hit. It is asking whether the route itself can still be trusted. That is why traffic data matters so much. Once transits fall sharply, once LNG carriers stop moving at normal levels, once insurers begin pulling back and ship owners hesitate, the disruption stops being hypothetical. The waterway may not be legally sealed, but commercially it starts behaving like a corridor under siege. Now add the military messaging on top of that. Iranian and IRGC-linked statements have tried to send a clear signal. Vessels that ignore warnings do so at their own risk. Those statements should not be repeated as fact beyond what is actually claimed. But they are still strategically important because the purpose is not only physical damage. It is deterrence by fear. It is telling the shipping world that uncertainty itself is now a weapon. And in a place like Hormuz, uncertainty can be almost as powerful as force. Because a tanker captain does not need to know whether every warning will be acted upon. The captain only needs to know that one wrong judgment could put the crew, the cargo, and the vessel in danger. A ship owner does not need a guarantee that insurance will be canceled forever. The owner only needs to know that the next voyage may come with costs, exclusions, and liabilities that make it commercially irrational. That is how strategic choke points get paralyzed. And once paralysis starts, the next question becomes obvious. Can the world route around it? The answer is only partially. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have some pipeline capacity that could bypass the strait for part of their crude exports. But the available alternative capacity is limited relative to the volumes that usually move through Hormuz. Other exporters depend overwhelmingly on the strait. LNG is even more exposed because there are no simple substitute routes for the volumes that normally leave Qatar and the UAE through that passage. That is why the disruption matters far beyond oil headlines. It touches gas, refining, shipping finance, freight risk, and emergency energy planning. It affects Asia most directly because so much of the oil and gas flowing through Hormuz is headed there. But the price impact is global, and global means everyone. Even countries with little direct dependence can feel it through market pricing. That is how this kind of crisis travels. It begins with a strike, a warning, or a disruption in one region. Then traders mark up the risk. Then insurers recalculate. Then ship owners delay. Then flows fall. Then prices move. Then governments start talking about reserves. Then industries that depend on predictable energy inputs begin modeling higher costs. Then consumers eventually feel some part of it, whether in fuel, freight, utilities, or broader inflation pressure. The route from security incident to household consequence is not always instant, but in a system this interconnected, it does not take long. There's another reason this moment matters. It challenges the old assumption that strategic waterways stay open simply because the world needs them open. People often talk as if economic necessity guarantees continuity. In reality, necessity can make a choke point more dangerous, not less. The more the world depends on a route, the more attractive it becomes for military pressure, coercive signaling, and market disruption. Hormuz has always carried that risk in the background. The difference now is that the background risk has moved into the foreground. That is why official language deserves careful attention. Maritime security bodies have been precise. They have not said there is a formal legal closure. They have said the environment reflects active kinetic hazard conditions and that attacks are almost certain at the current threat level. That distinction matters. It keeps the reporting honest, but it also points to something more important than legal wording: practical navigability. If the practical answer for many operators is not safely, not reliably, not right now, then the commercial effect can resemble closure, whether lawyers use that exact term or not. That is where some of the most irresponsible content online goes wrong. It jumps straight to absolute claims. Everything is destroyed, collapsed, or gone. The better way to communicate this is actually more powerful because it does not need exaggeration. The route is not normal. The risk is elevated to the highest warning level. Commercial shipping has pulled back sharply. Energy flows have been impeded, alternative routes are limited, and every additional incident increases the chance that temporary disruption becomes something longer and more destabilizing. That is already serious enough. So where does this go next? There are a few scenarios, and each one matters. The best case scenario is de-escalation fast enough that shipping confidence begins to recover before the commercial shutdown mentality becomes entrenched. In that case, some delayed cargoes move, insurance terms begin to normalize, and emergency stock releases buy enough time for markets to calm down. A middle scenario is worse: intermittent strikes, repeated warnings, occasional vessel incidents, and no clear restoration of confidence. In that world, flows remain far below normal even without a formal closure. Prices stay volatile. Emergency reserves become more important, and importers start planning for prolonged instability. The worst case is broader escalation that sustains the idea that Hormuz is unsafe for an extended period. That would deepen production cuts in the Gulf, intensify the draw on emergency stocks, and create much larger consequences for both oil and gas markets. No one should pretend to know with certainty which path comes next. But it is completely fair to say that the current trend line is dangerous. The IEA has said Gulf crude and product flows through the strait have plunged from around 20 million barrels per day before the war to a trickle, with storage filling up and producers already cutting substantial output. That sentence alone explains why the world is reacting so sharply. This is not just about fear. It is about actual movement of energy volumes through a system that has very few easy substitutes. And once flows fall that far, time starts to matter. Every extra day of impaired shipping makes it harder to treat this as a brief scare. Buyers begin looking for replacement cargoes. Sellers begin managing storage pressure. Governments begin thinking not just about prices, but about security of supply. Market participants who hope for a quick return to normal have to start planning for the possibility that normal may not return quickly. That shift in mindset is often the real turning point in a crisis. When people still believe disruption is temporary, they tolerate it. When they begin to suspect disruption may persist, they change behavior. And behavior is what moves markets. That is why tanker traffic data, insurance decisions, and official maritime advisories are so important. They reveal what participants are doing, not just what governments are saying. And what participants are doing right now suggests that fear in Hormuz is no longer theoretical. So when you hear the phrase no-go zone, do not hear it as a slogan. Hear it as shorthand for a more complicated reality. A waterway that may still exist legally as an international route, but is rapidly losing the commercial trust required to function normally. That distinction matters because it helps us understand the real danger. The danger is not only that a single ship gets hit. The danger is that enough ships decide not to go. The danger is not only one military claim. The danger is the cumulative effect of claims, warnings, incidents, and uncertainty. The danger is not only what is burning at sea today. The danger is what stops moving tomorrow. And for the global energy system, stopping movement is everything. If you strip away the noise, that is the headline story. Hormuz is becoming a test of how much disruption the world economy can absorb before emergency measures stop being a backstop and start becoming the main line of defense. That is why governments are discussing stock releases. That is why traders are repricing risk. That is why shipping is retreating. And that is why the story is much bigger than any single viral claim. The most important thing to watch now is not the loudest headline. It is whether normal commercial confidence returns. Do tankers start moving again in meaningful numbers? Do insurers restore workable coverage? Do Gulf exporters regain enough outlet capacity to prevent deeper production curtailments? Do buyers stop treating each transit as a gamble? If the answer to those questions stays no, then the world is looking at a sustained Hormuz crisis, not just a sharp shock. And that would mean the phrase no-go zone is no longer just rhetoric. It would mean it has become the operating reality of one of the most important maritime choke points on Earth.